starting at the front of the mat in Samastitihi, starting to come into an Ujjayi breath. So I won't cue Ujjayi breathing. I will just cue inhales, exhales, and the vinyasas, the count of the vinyasa, the transition, the movement in the body. So exhale all of the breath out. Inhale, arms float up, eyes to thumbs, 1. Exhale, swan diving forward, 2. Inhaling to a flat back, 3. Exhale, hands to the mat, walk or jump back, chaturanga, 4. Inhaling, upward dog, 5. Exhaling, downward dog on 6. In Ashtanga, I would stay here for 5 breaths. And the drishti, the focus point, is towards the belly button. We'll talk about this when we break down downward dog, but instead of pressing the chest down, I pull a little bit so I'm not sinking into my shoulders. My ribs are closed, Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha active. Eyes towards the belly or upper thighs. The end of your 5th breath out, bend the knees, look forward. Inhaling, walking or jumping between the hands into your flat back, 7. As you exhale, folding back forward, 8. Inhaling, rising to standing, lifting up, 9. As you exhale, back to Samastitihi. Okay, one more set with the Sanskrit terms so we can just get that into our brains. Take 1 breath in, 1 breath out. This time we will take 1 more time. So I will count in Sanskrit this time, as well as say just the posture names in Sanskrit and only say count, Sanskrit, and the breath, inhale or exhale. So very simple, and just to get an idea of the traditional way that it's practiced so that we have that in our brains. Okay? So exhaling the breath fully out. Inhaling Urdhva Tadasana, Ekam. Exhaling Uttanasana, Dve. Inhale, Trini, Urdhva Uttanasana. Exhale, hands down, walk or float, Chaturanga Dandasana. Inhaling, Urdhva Mukha Svanasana, Pancha. Exhaling, Adha Mukha Svanasana, Shat. Breathing for 1. Breathing for 2. 3. 4. At the end of your 5th exhale, bend the knees, look forward. Walk or float to the front into your flat back, Sapta. As you exhale, fold to the legs, Ashta Uttanasana. Inhaling back to standing, Urdhva Tadasana. As you exhale, Tadasana Samastitihi. Okay, so what we can see, we're going to kind of break down pose by pose. Mountain pose, we're going to come back a bit later. So we'll come back into standing postures, and we'll talk a bit more about what's happening in the legs in the bandhas later. So I'm going to focus on moving through our half vinyasas. So what it looks like to step back to plank or jump back to chaturanga and flow through that movement in the middle of the sun salutation. Okay, those postures are quintessential for Ashtanga practice, and they're also quintessential for vinyasa practice. So if you're doing them incorrectly, you can really start to damage the shoulder joints, possibly lower back, depending on how you're doing your back bend, cobra or upward facing dog. Okay, so we'll start with downward facing dog. And we always start with the foundations. So the foundation of any posture is what is connected to the ground. So we'll talk about this a bit more in the pausing to make sure that my microphone is still on. Okay. So we'll talk about this a bit more in our teaching methodology, about the base of support, the foundations. We'll come into that and combine them this week. But in downward facing dog, we're looking at the hands and the feet as the foundation, so an all fours posture. So downward dog, plank, chaturanga, we're on 4 points of contact. So we're on not just the hands and the knees, but either hands and shins, hands and feet, hands and tops of feet. So we have 4 points of contact, and that will be what we're looking at in terms of how it's placed and how we're connected and distributing weight with gravity. So we want to think about those things. So downward dog, we always start a bit with what's happening in the hands. And again, we don't always, you'll find a cue and instruction that connects with you. More than likely, whatever we're discussing during these classes will apply to maybe 95% of a class, 90 to 95%. But every alignment cue is not appropriate for every person. So you will have exceptions, you will have some very different body types in your practices. So each pose will externally look different. And even if they externally look the same, if you're looking at 2 students and they look relatively similar, they'll be feeling them very different in their bodies. That's based on how their joints can move, how the body can move, the muscle tone, the muscle flexibility. All of those will influence how someone is experiencing a yoga posture. So starting with the hands, when we're starting to look at the hands in our downward facing dog, we're looking at what is happening at the wrist crease. So when you flex your hands, anatomically when I hyperextend my hands, you'll notice there's these little wrinkles sort of right across the front of the wrist. So if I'm looking at those, I more or less try to bring those wrinkles so they're parallel to the front edge of my mat. So for some of us, you can explore for yourself. It's a very subtle movement, but for some of us, that will be the second finger parallel. For some of us, that will be the third finger parallel to the outside edge of the mat. So it depends on your wrist, it depends on what that looks like. And then notice that if my hands are down, so you can do this with me at home, if my hands are down on the floor, I want to think about rooting down through my thumb, through my second finger. So this stays pressing down. Okay? And then if I'm pressing that down, I can start to rotate the eye of my elbow. So this is an indicator. My elbow is not actually rotating, but this movement is coming from the joint above that when my arm is straight. So if my arm is straight, this rotation is actually happening here at my shoulder joint. Okay? So in a downward dog, depending on how we're looking at postures, we can think about different things. We can think about foundation, what is grounding, what is gross, what is connected to the floor, what is very physical. I can think about more subtle qualities of energetically what's happening, what is lifting, what is lengthening, what is spiraling. So often it's helpful to not necessarily just think about lines in the body, but think about movement as spiraling. Okay, so everything is spiraling, sometimes in opposite directions, and that gives a sense of movement so that a pose is not so static, it's not so angular or lined. So in our downward dog, what I like to think about is there's sort of 2 different spirals happening in the arm. So this outside rotation, this rotation through your shoulder, is a rolling outwards. It's an outward spiral of your upper arm. Okay, so if I roll that and I don't stop here, if I don't push my thumb and second finger, I can rotate more, but you'll notice that as I rotate more, I start to roll to the outside of my wrist. Okay, so if I'm not really gripping, so this is a common misalignment you'll see in students. So they'll roll and you'll see that their weight is very much outside on the outer edge of the wrist, and long term can already exacerbate wrist sensitivity that they might already have. So this is spiraling out, and then to counterbalance that, I think about the lower arm spiraling in. Okay, so there's sort of 2 different spirals happening through the shoulders. Okay, if I only think about rolling in, we'll try it when we put weight on our hands. So what that would look like if I was only rolling in. Okay, when I'm in a tabletop, you'll notice the eye of the elbow moves backwards. Okay, if I'm putting weight on my hands, that's going to roll the shoulder in and create a bit more tension into the neck. So it's putting your shoulder blades at a slightly different position. Okay, so just try that a few times for yourself. So coming to your hands, I want my hands in line with my shoulders for the most part. So all of my joints are aligned. They're in a kinetic chain linked with movement. And if I find the wrinkles in my wrist, so a little turn in, a little turn out, whatever I'm finding, whether that's your second finger or third finger, different options for different bodies. Okay, and then if I just play around a bit with this spiral through the shoulder joint. So I'm using my elbow as a reference. I'm keeping that press down with my thumb and my second finger. And closing your eyes as you rotate, you might also notice what's happening in the back of your shoulder at your shoulder blade. So there's a little different movement happening as you rotate. There's a different engagement in the back of the shoulder. There's a different engagement through your chest. So just noticing what that feels like for yourself. Okay. So just to see what that looks like, I'll come a little bit closer to you. So you can see my shoulders, what's happening when I'm rolling in and what's happening when I'm rolling out in the upper arms. Okay, and you'll notice a big difference in my neck, and not so much looking at the hands, but see what's happening across your shoulder blades here in the back, and also what's happening here in the neck. Okay, so coming just a little bit closer to you so that you can see my shoulders. Right now I'm in sort of my normal downward dog without trying too much. But if I roll my shoulders in, okay, I won't necessarily recommend that you try this because it doesn't feel great, but you'll see what's happening in my neck. And there's a little bit, for me, there's a little bit more of a pinching sensation on my right shoulder on this side. Okay, this is a rolling in of my upper arm bones. And then this is a rolling out. So we see that the neck is a little freer. There should feel like there's a little more space between the upper part of the neck and the lower ears. So the shoulders are out of the ears is a cue we might have heard. Okay, so getting that roll. All right. As I find that, you'll come to this in anatomy, but the muscle that's really helping that rotation, the movement of your shoulder blades around. I'm trying to get my shoulder blades to wrap to the outside of my rib cage. The muscle that is doing that is the serratus anterior. So it's a muscle on the side of the rib cage that when it's engaged, it almost feels like you're giving yourself a little hug. So we're going to try and activate that with a very simple exercise right now. This is in one of your first asana classes as well. So you might have already done it, but just to come back to it so we integrate it in our alignment classes. Okay, so very simple exercise from a tabletop. I sort of come into the chaturanga that I don't want to do. Okay, so I'm not doing push-ups, wide push-ups with the elbows out. In yoga, I'm keeping the elbows in. But in order to start to feel that, I bend my elbows outside just a little bit. Okay, so just about 1 or 2 centimeters. And then keeping that bend, I try to get the inside of the elbow forward. So I bend, I wrap, and I squeeze, keeping the elbows a little bit bent. And if you pull in through your belly, you'll feel probably across your chest, across your pecs, but you should also feel almost like a hugging sensation to the sides of your rib cage, like you're giving yourself a little bit of a hug. So rib cage is drawing a little bit closer in. So you can do that a few times. The elbows go out, and then the elbows wrap and gently squeeze, squeeze, squeeze in. And then I can shift back to straight arms. Okay, so just getting that sort of scoop and wrap is what we're aiming to do in our downward facing dog as well as in our chaturangas. Okay, I can do that movement in a downward dog. It's just a little bit more intense. I'll show you what that looks like from the side so you can see it. I call these downward dog push-ups. So if you're sort of starting to work towards dolphin, a forearm downward dog, or inversions on the forearms, this is really good to strengthen the side of the rib cage. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like if you wanted to try it, if you don't feel it, or you want a little bit more weight added to it. So in our downward dog, if I were to take a little bend, okay, what I don't want to see, this is me, when you see this in students, if their arms are not straight, as long as they don't have an anatomical reason why, it's because they're not pushing forward in their hands. So they're almost like, it's going to be really, really hard to hold here. It's going to require a lot more work. But if I want to actually intentionally do that, then I can wrap a little bit out, squeeze the elbows in, and I lower them almost to touch the floor. I don't let them touch. You see, I'm shaking here, and then I press back. I release the head. So my aim is to squeeze my elbows So they're in line with my shoulder and my wrist, and nothing has rolled outwards in the hands. Okay, so you can try this if you want to have a go. Again, it will be very intense. You don't have to come so low. So if I were to transition all the way down to dolphin just using strength, or to press back through downward dog, I'm not allowing that outward movement of the elbow, and that is coming from both the chest and the outer rib cage. Okay, so this is the upper body in our downward dog. We'll take a look at the legs and how to cue coming in. So mostly when we're looking at our downward dog, it looks like an equilateral triangle for most people. That might shift a bit if you have different proportions. So for me, for example, I actually have a really long wingspan. It's longer than my body. So my arms are actually a little bit disproportionate to my legs. So you might find slightly different versions, but once you kind of start observing students and observing people, you can really tell when people are too close or too far away. There's a little bit of space in between that, as long as you're doing it with intention and you kind of know where you're feeling it or want to feel it in your body, then it's fine. So normally I cue personally from a tabletop, at least for beginner students, from a tabletop where I have my joints aligned, my knees are under my hips, my hands are stacked, my shoulders stacked rather, right on top of my hands. Then just from that space, tucking the toes and just pressing back. Okay, so for some of us, we might want a little longer downward dog. So if you're setting it up from a plank, the plank will be a little bit longer. So from that space of shoulders over wrists, then I can just press back. This is also okay. So it doesn't mean that you need to get your heels to the floor, but see how much weight is in the upper body versus the legs. Okay. For me personally, I don't really feel much of a stretch if I'm too long. I feel it just a bit more when I'm just a little bit closer, and then I can feel that engagement, that active lengthening in the backs of my legs. Okay, so you can explore a bit with that. So second exploration is just see what it feels like from a tabletop, just to press into your downward dog, or see what it feels like to step the feet back to your plank and press to your downward facing dog. Okay, more or less keeping the feet hip distance and finding that same alignment of the outer edge of the foot, the little toe side. So this edge is more flat in the foot rather than the inner edge. The inner edge, the sole of the foot, the ball of the foot here is a little bit bigger in the front, and then it narrows as it comes to the heel. So this is an easier line of reference to keep. But when I'm looking back in my downward dog, the inner heel sort of disappears behind that second toe. So if I'm looking back and I can see my heel, as in this line here, then that means I'm rotating a bit too much in my hips. As my heel moves a bit out and my toes move forward, then I'm getting an inner spiral in the upper hips. Okay, so again, if we're talking about spirals, I sort of have those two directions in the body that I had in my arms, but they're the opposite spiral of the arms. So as I'm in my downward dog or most standing neutral positions in yoga, I have a little bit more of an inner spiral in the upper legs. Okay, so if I'm opening too wide, my feet are out in a V, more Pilates style or more like ballet dancer style, I'm rotating quite a bit in the hips, and that creates quite active glute muscles. So in the feet, I aim for a little bit of rolling in. Okay, so there's a slight internal, not too much. You'll notice for me if I keep rolling in, my kneecaps, which are a good reference, point too far in. So just enough that you feel the upper thigh bones right at your pubic bone rolling a bit in towards your center line. And then we balance that by what's happening in the lower legs. So maybe it's not so much that I want to think about they're moving outwards, but I think about pushing the feet a little bit outwards. So that stabilizes. I can think a little bit of a rotation in the lower leg, but just not to keep the knee twisting in counter directions. It's not a great feeling, okay? So one way to do that, and we'll pause and take a moment for an application, again, an exploration. So we'll take a block If you're using a book, it's going to be a little harder. But we'll take a block and we'll take a strap. If you don't have a strap, you can tie yourself in with like a rolled up towel. That will also be okay. So strap, we will take and we'll loop it depending on your strap. You'll have to see for your loop, but we'll make this one closes twice, but you can make your strap into a loop that will stay. Okay, you can adjust it once you make your circle, that's fine. Okay, but more or less, I'm going to take the strap just to the outside edges of the calf muscles. Then I can kind of tighten it in. I'm gonna need a little bit of space to adjust. So just that press, if I push and roll, so if I'm pushing too far out and I let my ankles move, you'll notice it rolls me to the outside of my feet. So I really want to make sure that I get that push, not of the toes themselves, but of the big toe mounds, the big toe knuckles. So if I'm pressing there, big toe knuckles, outer edges of your heels, and then I try to drag the feet out. So I'm almost pushing against this strap that is here while pressing my big toes down, okay? If you do that without any movement or without being in a specific shape, and you just press out, release, then you'll notice it's a bit of an engagement right across the sides of the body. So it'll feel more active a bit in the side glutes and into the IT band, okay? When we fold forward, it will have a second purpose as well. So that movement out in the lower legs, and then with my upper legs, and you might need to set your block first. So with the block, some people really want to put it this way. This is a little bit probably too close for some of us. If you have wider legs or more fleshy parts, this will be okay. But you can take it closer up towards your pubic bone. So you really get that gripping action. So if you're taking your block this way, that's fine. Just make sure that your feet still feel comfortable. If you're taking it a little lower, you can put it on a slightly medium setting. And then I might need to adjust my strap here, but I want to feel very snug. So I should feel a really, really powerful squeeze. So in order to squeeze this block, that same movement in with the legs as I push my big toes down and drag my feet apart. Okay, and then your legs should actually feel in standing pretty active. Okay, I should have started at that end of the mat, but I'm gonna wobble myself backwards, okay? And then I'm just going to come into, I can take this shape in a forward fold. The movement would be the same. The action in my legs would be the same. So I get that grip of the inner thighs. But then I can just walk my hands forward into more or less my downward dog. If your feet aren't exactly hip width, that's fine. It's just more to get the sensation of really squeezing the inner thighs and pressing the calves, the heels out into your band. So it should make the legs feel quite a bit more active in the pose and actually carry the stretch more into your hamstrings. Okay, so you can try this, stay for a couple of breaths. Just notice how strong the sensation feels in the inner thighs with your block and how you feel in the lower legs and your feet. Good, and then very gently. So you could shift also, you could do the same coming through your high plank. If you just wanted to get that grip of your legs, just stepping the feet back and rolling the body forward. So you still get that squeezing sensation of your block. The glutes are active, the belly is active, and the hands are active. Okay, and then releasing. Carefully knees down, remove your block first, and then you can let go of your strap. Okay. Whew. So you should feel pretty active in your inner thighs now. You should feel what that sensation will be like in a downward dog and a high plank. So taking a look at the pose overall, we talked about the shoulders, we talked about the legs. We didn't yet specifically talk about the spine, but this is what's happening in the legs and the shoulders is influential in what's happening in the spine. So the movement or the mobility in the back will be influenced by what you're doing in your legs and your arms. So in downward dog, this is pretty much one of our main key elements, is finding that lengthening in the back where the spine is, we can say flat, So you do really get that extension. Okay, so there's a movement in both directions from your crown down through your tailbone, or up through your tailbone since it's a mild inversion. Okay, so we're getting that pull in order to elongate the spine, and then we can isolate a bit more into what's happening in our arms and what's happening into our legs. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of common misalignments. There's sort of the opposite extremes of someone who's really, really tight in the backs of the hips and the hamstrings. They have a tendency to round into the lower back. So just an example is if someone cannot sit with a completely upright spine here, okay, then they're not going to be able to have a straight spine in their downward facing dog. As soon as I bend my knees, if I'm sitting, then that frees up a bit the mobility I have in my pelvis, and it's the same in our downward facing dog. Okay, the other option, or the other extreme, is someone who's really, really flexible either in the lower back or also in the shoulder joint. So this movement in the shoulders where the chest comes forward. So I'm not super mobile, but there are many people who can really, really press and melt the heart down. So if you're really, really open there, then you might be one of the people that can get your head to the floor. And that's not really the goal, the aim in Ashtanga, but in certain other practices like Dharma Mitra, often the forehead will come to the floor. For me, that will probably not happen ever, only if I'm really, really warm and really, really open in my shoulders. But there's also less stability in that shape. So again, see what you're aiming for as a teacher. As I said, we can have a specific aim for us as a teacher, or maybe a certain style. So Ashtanga might have a different version of downward dog than a Dharma Mitra class. So see what your intention is, and then make sure your students are safe in practicing that. Okay, so those two versions, I'll sort of demo what those look like. But in Ashtanga, if you use your drishti and your bandhas, it pretty much sets up your spine in the most stable shape that's possible. So as long as I'm pulling in Uddiyana Bandha, I have a hollow belly shape. Yeah? So there's a hollowing out of the front of the body. Then that keeps the body, the spine, in a more neutral, straight, flat spine, rather than rounding or arching too much in the body. Okay? So what those look like, I'll try to do both. So if I'm really inflexible, that means I'm really tight. Basically my hamstrings, which cross the knee, they cross my hips. They're so tight that they pull my pelvis, they pull my hips towards my heels. So if I'm rounding in my downward dog, you'll often see this. Okay? So the spine is rounded, and it also puts more weight into my hands. So it doesn't give me a lot of ability to push if I can't move my hips anywhere. Okay? And then the opposite of that, I'll come a little bit longer for me to do this, is someone that's super mobile. So already just the lower back is so lifted. So I have first option where I'm really almost in a back bend in my lower back, or maybe in my shoulders are really open and I'm all the way down. So in this version, I can't see my belly button. So I can change my drishti. So just changing my drishti first brings me out of my shoulders, and then activating Uddiyana Bandha especially, so that hollow shape will carry the rest and support the lower back. Okay. So key alignment, look at the spine. Key alignment, second one I would say, look at the shoulders, what's really happening. Because for students, for me, the common tendencies of people complaining about pain in sun salutations or downward dog, they either feel it in their neck, partially because they're trying to see the teacher, they're looking up, or they feel it in their lower back, especially a bit more in women. So if you're really flexible, you want to be careful that you're not coming into that hyper extended, that back bend of the lower back in your downward facing dog.